recording at this point. So again, thank you for coming. Welcome, everybody. I was thinking back in December when I'm thinking, okay, what am I going to do for my first presentation of the year? And I kind of came up with handbooks because I'd heard from a couple of clients, I really need to get a handbook. It's been on my to-do list for the last couple of years. I just haven't gotten it done yet. So I thought, oh, that's probably one of those things that's out there that everybody is thinking, yeah, I need to be doing that. So thought that was a good way to start off the new year. I do always like to let everybody know that I am not an employment attorney, although I'm going to be touching on statutes and legal issues throughout this. And I do regularly correspond with employment attorneys, but I am not one. So this cannot be used as any kind of legal advice. I always recommend that any handbook that you do get an actual attorney review done at the end of it. I also wanted to just throw out there that everything that I talk about today is really only relevant to you if you are in a non-union environment. If you have union employees, handbooks serve a totally different purpose because it's your union contract that's going to rule. So just bear in mind, if anybody out there has union employees, that the handbook content that I'm talking about is really going to be relevant primarily to non-union. I'm assuming that everybody is in a non-union background. Or non-union environment. So just wanted to put that out there just to avoid any kind of confusion if any of you do have a union out there and a collective bargaining agreement that you're governed by. So we're going to take some time to just generally review, why do you want a handbook? How do you get started with rewriting it or with revising it? Some of you might already have a really good one in place, but you just need to update it periodically. We're going to spend some time on actually developing policies because this is kind of an opportunity. We are hopefully coming off of COVID at some point in the next several months. And workplaces have changed and your policies should change to reflect that as well. I'll give you some helpful hints for actually putting it all together. And then we're going to talk a little bit about, okay, you've got your handbook. Now, how do you use it? How do you make sure that it doesn't just sit there on a server or on a shelf and never to be seen again? So I'm going to launch a poll here. I kind of want to see where everybody is on their handbook. So I'm assuming that that's out there right now because I'm seeing responses. I'm trying to get an idea of, how many of you actually have a handbook? What's the status of your handbook? What are you dealing with? Okay. All right. So looks like we are pretty much done there. I'm going to share the results. So I do have a couple of you out there that actually don't have a handbook. So you're starting from scratch. So that's okay. The woefully out of date, I'm not surprised. I'm pretty sure it's okay. We don't have anybody that's saying, I'm not sure if it's okay or not. So at least you kind of have an understanding of where you should be. And picking up pointers. I think that's a really, really good reason for being here because hopefully, some of this might be review for you. And if anything, it might confirm that, yeah, what we've got is pretty good. Or you might pick up a couple of helpful hints of how you might go about actually editing it. So thank you very much for doing that. So one thing that I wanted to kind of make clear up front, I think a lot of people get confused between an employee handbook and a policy and procedures manual. They, in my viewpoint, are two very different things. Your handbook is really defining what your expectations are of your employees and what your employees can expect from you as an employer. It should have that welcoming aspect. You should have your organizational culture infused throughout it. So, you want to be setting expectations, right? What do you expect? How do you expect your employees to behave? And in turn, what can they expect from you as their employer? It should be guidelines for how you run your organization. There should be flexibility built into that, into your policies. For the most part, there should be some gray area, some discretion for, what is appropriate to the circumstance that I'm faced with. Um, again, it should only really include what's relevant to most employees. So, more of the overarching policies as opposed to what particular policies and procedures are within a particular department. And it should just kind of be that one-stop resource for, this is the go-to for your employees. So when they've got some sort of an employment related issue, this is where they go to get their answer. It should also serve as a resource for your managers, because especially your new managers, they're not going to be familiar with all of the nuances of the organization. So this is a good one-stop resource for them as well. Your policy manual, on the other hand, is much more fact-based. It's much more policies and procedures. If this happens, you do this. It's much more dictatorial. So, for example, you can have an FMLA policy in your handbook, and it's going to talk about who qualifies, a little bit of a background about FMLA, how do you go about applying, but it's not going to have in there what the behind the scenes administration of FMLA involves. So it's not going to be, first you're going to get this notice that you have 15 days to get your medical information back. It's really going to be more overarching and notifying the employees of what their rights are. The other piece that I tend to see in handbooks is, an I-9. Well, we expect all of our employees are going to be presenting identification so that they can complete an I-9. Remember, once your employees are actually on board and they're getting a handbook, they've already completed an I-9. So there really isn't a reason for that to necessarily be there. So I'm kind of putting that out there as an example. So, your policies and procedures are great if they're housed within an individual department so that you've got employees that know how to actually administratively do their job. But the administration piece really doesn't belong in an employee handbook. So they're really two different things. The purpose of a handbook, again, we're clarifying that employer-employee relationship so that everybody's clear what can you expect of each other. And I think that a handbook should really build trust between the employer and the employee. There is a need in a handbook to be presenting some pretty clear policies because that is required by statute. We're going to talk about that in more detail in a little bit, particularly a sexual harassment policy. You do need to include that in a handbook. Again, guidelines. You'll notice I keep using that word guidelines because you want to leave room for that gray area. But it's going to give you, it's going to give a place for your employees to go to get some of their questions answered. I will tell you that the first place that all of your employees are going to go, and probably the most referred to place in your handbook, is going to be your PTO time, right? Maybe your holidays too, but your PTO. So, your handbook should get looked at for things like that. And hopefully it's going to get looked at for a lot more too. But, it talks about your workplace protocol. How do we expect you to behave in the workplace? How do we expect you to be treating your coworkers, to be treating clients? You can touch on things like benefits, but again, for the most part, it's not going to be the benefits like benefits. You're probably not going to have the details of this is what your medical benefits entail. But what you are going to outline in there is who is eligible for what benefits? How many hours a week do you need to work in order to be eligible for benefits? And in the long run, a handbook should save time because, again, it's going to hopefully give that one-stop shopping to answer some of these questions. By putting these guidelines in there, it is promoting consistency. If you don't have guidelines, behavior can be all over the place. How you handle situations can be all over the place. And then you run the risk that you're not treating similarly situated employees in similar fashions. So that will potentially help to protect you from legal action because at least there is a certain realm of consistency in how you treat all of your employees. And again, it's a tool for just familiarizing your employees with your company. What are you all about? What do you stand for? What is your philosophy? What is your mission? What is your vision? All of these things should be infused into your handbook. And again, especially in these changing times that we're in right now, this is an ideal opportunity to really take a look at your handbook and say, where do we need to make changes? What's changed over the last year? Probably a lot. There's probably a lot of tone that you might want to put in there, that's changed based on what's been going on in the world with the pandemic. I have gotten questions about things like, well, should we now be setting parameters on working from home? And if this is something that you're going to be embracing after the pandemic, by all means, put something in there that talks about what are our expectations if you're going, for those of you who are working remotely. So, kind of take a look at your handbook with fresh eyes and say, it's time. It's time to change it. It's time to update it. Out with the old, in with the new. I think one of the hardest things about putting a handbook together is just, where do I start? Particularly if this is your first time ever putting a handbook together or ever really revising a handbook. It's kind of hard to actually just plunge in and get going. So I'm kind of hoping I can break it out for you a little bit. I think one thing that you really need to consider, I think you're all here because you're looking at doing this in-house. If you are someone who has been trying to get this done for the last 2 or 3 years and it just hasn't happened, you may want to take a look at outsourcing that and having somebody else do it for you. If you've never done a handbook before and your primary role is not HR, handbooks aren't always easy to put together. There are a lot of little nuances in there, and how do you word your policies? You might want to think about outsourcing it, but cost, of course, is a factor. I mean, I don't do handbooks for free. There is a cost involved, but you kind of have to weigh the pros and the cons. So, take a look at the experience of who it is that's actually putting this together, and what are the time constraints? How realistic is it that you're going to be able to set aside the time that it takes? Because it really is time consuming to do a handbook and to do it right. So just some things to be thinking about before you even get started. There are a lot of templates out there, and templates can be a really good place to start. If you are a SHRM member and you have access to SHRM, there are a lot of templates out there. I've seen a lot of organizations borrow one from another organization. This is particularly common, I'm finding, in the nonprofit world, where they'll take a similar organization and say, can we borrow your handbook? And they kind of use it as a template. And it's good for getting started and for getting ideas and maybe borrowing some wording, but I really do need to caution you that it's not a one size fits all. You kind of run the risk of actually losing your identity with that, because somebody else's handbook is going to reflect their organization, not yours. I've also seen people borrow handbooks and they've got laws in there that don't even apply to them, because they might have borrowed it from a larger organization. So there might be a whole section on FMLA and you've only got 20 employees and FMLA doesn't even apply to you. You're falling under the Vermont Parental and Family Leave Act, not the federal FMLA. So you kind of have to be aware of those things if you're going to be using a template. And most templates that are out there with SHRM too are going to talk about FMLA. They're not going to talk about specific state statutes that you should have in there from the state of Vermont. Again, so it's good as a guide. You might want to take a look at a table of contents of one of these templates, and that can kind of be your checklist to say, yeah, we want to have this and we want to have this, but there's a section in this template that I don't think is really relevant to us, so we're not going to include that. So that might be helpful just to kind of see if you're getting all of the components in there. And if you're going to do this, I just want to prepare you, there's still going to be a lot of work to be done. There's going to be a lot of rewording to make it yours and to make it reflective of your culture. So you want to take a template and say, okay, that's a blank slate, but there's a lot that needs to be done in order to make it relevant for my organization and for my employees. So do we have any questions so far? Is anybody brave enough to unmute themselves? Okay, and if you do have questions, you can always type them in the chat. I've got Anita looking at the chat. Okay, we'll keep moving forward then. So there are some things that every handbook, at least in the state of Vermont, really should have. So let's start with those. There should be an employment at will statement, because you want to be very clear up front that that employment at your organization is at will. And just a quick review for anybody who maybe is new to the HR world. At will means that you as an employer have the ability to hire anybody at any time and to terminate anybody at any time and for any lawful reason. Okay. So you want to have that statement out there, because you want to put that front and center. So I would say that should be right at the beginning of your handbook. And there should also be something in there stating right off the top that the handbook is not a contract of employment. Now, just because you have that doesn't mean that there can't be components that sneak in there that create what's called an implied contract. So, just because you have that doesn't protect you from being very careful with the subsequent wording. So, hold on one second, because I just got a message from Anita because she lost contact, but I'm still on. So just going to text her back. Sorry about that. There should also be right up front an EEO policy, something talking about, anti-discrimination, and that should indicate what the most current protected classes are. And there are some classes that are protected on the federal level and some that are protected on the state level. So there should also be in there, you should be stating something like, or any other class that's protected from by federal or state statute. And that makes it all encompassing, because sometimes these protected classes do change. But if you haven't updated your handbook in a long time, chances are you're missing some recent protections. So you can easily find that online. It's online with the state of Vermont. If you Google it, it should pop up. It probably is out there on HR 360 as well. But that EEO anti-discrimination policy statement should be in there. Most of you probably have that. I know that even just to get general liability insurance, one of the questions on an insurance application is, do you have an EEO policy? And you've probably all checked the box that says yes. So that should be out there in your handbook, and that way it's disseminated to everybody. Employment classification should be in there so that you're clearly defining what does exempt mean, what does non-exempt mean, full-time, part-time, temporary, seasonal, contractor, so that it's very clear what the criteria is for each one. And that will help throughout the handbook, because you might in a benefits section be referring to some benefits that your full-time employees get. Well, who's full-time? And that definition can vary from organization to organization. Some say it's 40 hours a week, some say 35 hours a week. More and more have gone with 30 hours a week, because that way it's consistent for the eligibility for healthcare. So it's really prudent to be defining that somewhere in the handbook. And then an acknowledgement of receipt. And by an acknowledgement of receipt, it means I've acknowledged that I've received this handbook, and that's it. You don't want to say anything about, I'm going to abide by the terms of this handbook, because an employment attorney will tell you that that reeks of implied contract. That's contractual language. So what you want is for the employee to acknowledge the fact that they've received the handbook. And that can be in written form, depending on whether you're handing them an actual written handbook, or if you have your handbook online somewhere. You can have an acknowledgement, an online acknowledgement. Those of you that are on ease for their benefits, you can load your handbook on there, and that can be something that your employees acknowledge when they're enrolling in their benefits, and they can acknowledge it every year when they're going through enrollment. So should have an acknowledgement of receipt. Any kind of a policy that enforces statute should be in there. ADA compliance should definitely be in there. Sexual harassment, there's your link to the Vermont model sexual harassment policy. And I would strongly urge you to follow that, because if the state of Vermont has put it out there and said, this policy meets all of the requirements under Vermont statute, then you know that you're covered. And there's quite a bit of customization that needs to be done with that. So if you haven't updated your sexual harassment policy in the last 2 to 2.5 years, chances are you don't have this new model policy in there. Because the state of Vermont has some very, very specific standards that you need to follow, including listing contact information, full contact information for who people can go to file a complaint. So it's not okay to just say, go to human resources to file a complaint. It needs to be much more specific than that. If you have employees in a state that mandates break times, there should be information in there. We are going to talk a little bit later about some helpful hints for if you are a multi-state employer. But just to touch on that briefly now, I tend to like to see addendums for different states. And that's where you can put things in there like, what are the mandated break times? If you have employees in New York is pretty heavily legislated with how many hours you work before you're entitled to a break if you're non-exempt. And that should be included in the handbook. But Vermont doesn't have mandated break times other than saying that people need to have a reasonable amount of time to use the facilities. That's pretty much all Vermont says. Overtime, you should have something in there that clearly states if you work over 40 hours, you are entitled to overtime if you're non-exempt. And again, this is where it's important to be defining who's exempt and who's non-exempt as well. Earned sick time, because Vermont does have an earned sick time law. And one of the pieces that I've seen a lot of clients miss is what can that earned sick time be used for? So that should be included in there, that it can be used for your own illness. It can be used for a family member's illness. There's that snow day provision where you can use it if the facility where a dependent is receiving care is closed due to an emergency, which a snow day is. It came into play with COVID. And it also says if you're seeking any kind of a relief from stalking. So all of those things should be included in your earned sick time policy. If you combine earned sick time with PTO time, which a lot of organizations do, again, check and just make sure that it meets those minimum requirements. And then again, when you're stating what PTO time can be used for, you should be including the components that are listed under Vermont's earned sick time law. Crime victim leave, because again, Vermont entitles employees to unpaid time off if they are the victim of a crime and they are participating in getting a restraining order or in going to court for any kind of a case that's related to that. So you can actually look this up on HR 360. There's a state resources tab, and that will fill you in on the crime victims leave. FMLA absolutely should be in there. And there should be a section for all of you who are 10 or more employees on VPFLA, because there are some differences. Definition of pay dates, if your pay is less frequently than weekly. And this is something not all employers realize, that Vermont says you need to pay your employees weekly. However, you can pay them bi-weekly or you can pay them twice a month, but you need to tell your employees in writing that you're doing that. So you will be covered if you put that into your handbook and say, we get paid bi-weekly, paydays are Thursdays, put that into your handbook, and then your dissemination requirement for being paid less frequently than weekly is covered. Flexible work arrangements. In Vermont, employees are entitled to ask for flexible work arrangements up to 2 times annually. So there should be something in the handbook about that. And nursing mothers, Vermont has laws as far as break times for nursing mothers and the provisions for providing them with those break times. So again, these are Vermont policies, so I think it's a good idea to have it out there in your handbook. It's also a good idea to have an overarching anti-harassment policy in addition to your sexual harassment policy. So, obviously Vermont says that you need to disseminate a sexual harassment policy, and your handbook is probably the best way to do that. And as part of that, you're probably going to want to incorporate overall discriminatory harassment, because sexual harassment is just one form of discriminatory harassment. And what a lot of handbooks do is they'll have a paragraph about discriminatory harassment, and then they'll move into sexual harassment. And somewhere in there, it will say that the protocol for sexual harassment is the protocol that you follow for any kind of discriminatory harassment. So both of those should be pretty clear in the handbook. A time off policy, again, this is the number one reason why I think you're going to find most of your employees are going to their handbook, because they want to know how much time off they get, right? Some things that you should be thinking about when you're crafting a time off policy, and as far as making it really clear in the handbook, because that's what you want. You want it to be clear. You should obviously define which employees get what. What do full-time employees get? What do part-time employees get? Is part-time prorated? Is it accrued based on how many hours that you work? You know, how often is that bank credited? Is it every pay period? Do you give it to everybody up front? You know, whatever the case may be, because your time off, you know, other than your earned sick time and your FMLA and things that are covered under statute, your vacation time isn't there. There's nothing that legally says you need to provide with vacation time or personal time. This is totally up to you. So it's just important that you be clear with it. You know, be clear as far as when are you eligible to use this? Is there a waiting period before you're eligible to use your vacation time? Some organizations have blackout periods. You know, we have a really busy time every year in July and August. So nobody's allowed to take PTO time during July and August. Put it in there. Again, because it avoids confusion and it helps you to be consistent with your employees. You know, how do you put in for vacation time? When are they actually eligible to do it? Is it accrued? Do you give it to them all up front? How do you handle carryovers? How do you handle a 12-month period? Some do it anniversary date to anniversary date. Some do it calendar year. You know, when you hit a certain anniversary date, once you've been with us for 5 years, you get an extra week of vacation. Well, how do you define the 5 years? Is it the calendar year that your 5th year anniversary happens? Is it on your 5th year anniversary? Those things tend to kind of get overlooked sometimes in policies. I think it's important to also put in there, you know, any other kinds of paid or unpaid time off that they get. You know, do you offer the bereavement time, the jury duty time, volunteer time? A lot of organizations offer time off to employees to participate in volunteer activities. I think that's wonderful. Put it in your handbook. Talk about that. Put that out there. I think that's a really, really nice perk and it's very meaningful to a lot of your employees. You know, religious observances, unpaid leave of absence. I'm just going to touch on that for a minute, because that came into play a lot more in these times of COVID, because employees were running through what was entitled to them under the law. And there was also that question initially when everybody started getting laid off with, is this a layoff? Is this a furlough? You know, what is this? And, you know, it was really helpful when employers had an unpaid leave of absence policy in their handbook, because where that comes into play on the benefits end is benefits providers are generally say you have to be an active employee in order to be covered under the group plan. And you're continued to be covered under the group plan if you're taking a leave that's covered by statute. So if somebody is on an FMLA, they're of course continued to be covered under the benefits plan. Where it gets fuzzy is if somebody's is not at work for a reason other than that, like they've used up COVID time and they still need to take more time off. If you can put them on an unpaid leave of absence, most insurance carriers say that if your employees are on a leave that's sanctioned by the organization under their policy, that's covered under an employment policy, they can continue their benefits. So if you've got an unpaid leave of absence policy, somebody's used up their time, you want to give them a couple of extra weeks because you want to do the right thing. it just eliminates that question of, can they stay on our health benefits or not? If they're on a leave of absence under a policy that is provided by your company, they can stay under the health plan generally. And again, you always need to take a look at your plan documents and check with your account exec. But in general, your employees can still be covered. And you should always have, again, in there anything under FMLA, or if you've got a company sponsored parental leave, that should be in there. And again, any additional state entitlements, more and more states are providing paid family leave for mandated paid family leaves. So this is where some sort of an addendum, if you have employees that are covered under different state FMLA plans, a different addendum that talks about each state is really helpful, because again, that will satisfy your dissemination requirements in those states as well. Some other things that you might want to put in there. And again, this is all up to you. But these are things that tend to be relatively common in a handbook. Dress code, again, it depends on your organization. You really may not care about a dress code, or, maybe you're in a professional work environment and your employees come to work dressed professionally enough, and it's really not an issue. So you might not even need to have one, but a lot of organizations have them. Hours of work, if you've got standard hours of work that your employees absolutely need to be there. If you are running a retail store and you're open from 10 to 6, your employees need to be there from 10 to 6. So you might want to put your hours of work. If you're an office environment, it doesn't matter so much. You probably don't need to put that in there. Or maybe you have core hours of time, 10 to 2, we expect everybody to be in the office or to be working. Use of social media, that I would recommend. There are a lot, that's kind of a fuzzy area, but I would recommend that you put some sort of a social media policy in there. And that is definitely one of those policies that you should have an attorney take a look at, because it's kind of a fine line between what you can allow and how you can regulate somebody's personal social media use. So definitely one of those things that you want to have an attorney review before you put it out there. Appropriate use of company equipment. And you also want to have in there that, all of your anti-harassment policy should also apply to any time that an employee is using your equipment. So your equipment shouldn't be used for harassing behavior. That should all be in there. Travel and expense reimbursement, I'm a little on the fence with whether that should be there or not. Some employers put it in there as an addendum if it's something that's really important. I think right now, nobody's traveling for business, so, or very few people are. It kind of depends on your organization. If under normal circumstances, travel is a big part of what your employees do, you might want to have it in there. If most employees don't have to travel, probably can just be a separate policy outside of your handbook. Smoking, a lot of employers address that. And remember, if you're putting a smoking policy together, to also include e-cigarettes in there. I think everybody kind of realizes it's one and the same, but not everybody does. So you might want to just include cigarettes as well as e-cigarettes. Drug-free workplace, that should definitely be in there. Workplace safety. Remember, your handbook is not a safety manual. So you don't want to have specifics in there as far as steel-toed shoes are going to be required in this area, but not in this area. But what you do want to do is have a workplace, maybe make reference to your safety manual. And again, it depends on what kind of an organization you're in. Do you have a safety manual? And if you do, referring to it, like saying, we expect all of our employees to adhere strictly to the protocol as outlined in our safety manual. And if you have your handbook online, you can actually put a live link in there, linking you to the safety manual. So I would say referring to it, referring to safety protocol, but actually outlining safety protocol probably gunks up a handbook too much. And then, any other programs that you have that, again, talk about who you are and what you do, by all means, put them in there. If you've got a mentoring program, put it in there. That's something to be proud of. Casual days, we used to have, that used to be more common. Now casual days tend to be every day, but, put it in there. If you're expecting, professional attire, but you can wear jeans on Friday, put it in there. If you have a continuing education benefit, if you offer tuition reimbursement, put it in there. Any kind of an employee recognition program. If you've got a diversity, equity, and inclusion program, put that in there as well. Things that are going to help your employees to understand who you are as an organization and what their role is as part of it. By all means, have it in there. I wanted to touch on disciplinary policy a little bit because I get this question a lot, particularly if you're looking at a discipline policy that has been there for a long time. So it used to be when I started out in HR, which is the dark ages compared to now, 35 years ago. I think we have somebody out there maybe who isn't muted. So if everybody can just check their mutes, that would be great.
Let me mute. I'm listening to a webinar.
Let's see, maybe I can find out who it is.
So she's out today and tomorrow?
Yeah, Susan, I can't mute that person.
It doesn't matter anymore.
Yeah, no, it's your time because
Okay.
we're not doing the. No.
Yeah, somebody, if everybody,
Um,
if you wouldn't mind just checking and if your
Is it the
mute is
one
on,
who traveled from
No, she came back negative.
because somebody is not muted.
Okay, so has this one been exposed or is she not feeling
Oh.
it?
I got it. Okay, I got it. We're good. Sorry about that. Oh, don't we love Zoom? Maybe someday we're actually all going to be piling into that little conference room in South Burlington again. But for now, this is what we've got. So disciplinary policy, again, when I started in HR, every handbook had a very stringent disciplinary policy that usually it went something like this. You start out with a verbal warning, then you get a written warning, then you get a final warning, and then you're shown the door, right? Nowadays, that really doesn't belong in a handbook because how that has evolved over the years is that has really created an implied contract. So it's kind of implied that employees are entitled to that progression. And even if you have a policy like that in your handbook and it says we reserve the right to go through all of these steps or to use our discretion to not follow these steps. Again, I'm parroting recommendations from employment attorneys who say it just shouldn't be there. And a lot of times it can potentially get you into more trouble if you actually don't follow it, because again, it's kind of guaranteeing this due process. And then if you're not following it, it can get you into more trouble. Anytime you've got a policy in a handbook that you don't follow, the risk that you run is that an employment attorney, if there's ever a charge filed, is going to have a heyday and say, well, you're only selectively following your policies. So this whole handbook is out the window. It's null and void. And any kind of a disciplinary policy, right, kind of erodes that employment at will. So think about how we talked about in the very beginning. You should have that statement that says, we can hire and we can fire for any lawful reason that we want. And then you put a disciplinary policy in there. And that's kind of contradictory to being able to make an employment decision based on our own discretion. So I would strongly recommend that you take that out. You might get some manager pushback on this because managers like to see things outlined. They like to know that they're handling a disciplinary issue in a way that somebody is telling them they need to handle it, instead of actually using their own discretion and saying this situation warrants this. Disciplinary action, no two situations are ever going to be alike. So You need to leave room in your handbook and in your practices for using your discretion based on the situation at hand.
Can I ask a question on that, Susan?
Sure.
If you want me to wait till a breaking point, just say.
No, go right ahead. This is fine.
So, I mean, we definitely have a disciplinary policy, but I guess, are you referring to just get rid of the steps of retribution, or like don't even list causes of discipline, like all of that needs to go?
I wouldn't even list the causes for discipline because, again, you can't possibly capture every single situation out there. And I know that a lot of organizations like to list examples. And I know that that's prefaced, and I'm pretty sure, Dan, in your handbook, it's prefaced with, this is not all encompassing. These are just examples. But from what I am gleaning from employment attorneys, it's really kind of best to not put that in there because you really want it to be up to you. Now, what you might want to do is have guidelines, right? But not necessarily in the handbook. So you might want to provide your managers with guidelines of this is how we handle our disciplinary issues. Or this is how we strive to handle them, but you know what? We don't always handle them this way. But here are the guidelines for how we want to potentially have you as a manager handling disciplinary actions. That's okay. But as soon as you put it out there in the handbook, there's that kind of implication of a due process that could potentially get you into trouble.
Very interesting.
Yeah, so good question. So I do have clients come to me to actually do entire handbooks for them, or occasionally they come to me to work with me just to do rework a couple of policies. Almost always it's a PTO and a time off policy. So so that says to me, there are a lot of organizations out there that are really reevaluating their PTO policies. How do they want to handle PTO? And some have made changes for PTO policies just in 2021 in light of COVID, realizing that they need to continue with more flexibility. Some people have already used up the time that they were allotted for COVID-related reasons, and they want to make sure that employees are entitled to some additional time off because these are not normal times. Paid family leave, more and more organizations are putting that into place. So it's something you might want to think about because you, of course, want to stay competitive in the workplace, in the labor market. And family leave is important to a lot of people. So you might want to think about that. Use of social media, again, it's one of those things that if you haven't looked at your handbook in several years, social media probably isn't addressed in there. So a lot of organizations are now putting that in. And pets in the workplace. There are an awful lot of companies here in Vermont that are pet friendly. And what happens sometimes is if you don't have some parameters on when your dogs can come into the workplace, it can get a little bit out of hand. So I've actually rewritten a lot of pets in the workplace policies, and they're all based on how welcoming and accommodating do you want to be to pets. But at the very least, putting something in there saying that you're expecting that every owner is going to take responsibility for their pet in the workplace and making sure that they've gotten their immunizations so that you don't run into an issue. What if one of the dogs snaps at somebody, right? You want to make sure that the dogs are properly, have all of their shots. So let's talk a little bit more about actually putting policies together. Because this is the hard part is, okay, we're going to revamp some of our policies, and how do I do that? How do I begin that? So, I think first and foremost, you should really only be including anything that has to do with that, again, that employer-employee relationship. What do we expect of you as an employee? So it's not necessary to have policies in there talking about, again, a safety policy. You don't necessarily have to have your safety policy in there because that really doesn't have anything to do with what is your relationship with us as your employer? Again, it should be pretty much policies that are going to apply to all staff. So if you've got certain policies that are really only relevant to, say, your manufacturing employees, it doesn't necessarily belong in your handbook. One thing I want to caution you about is managing to the exception. So I have had people come to me and say, we're having problems with an employee, so we want to change our policy so that we can address that problem with the employee. And you might have 40 other employees who you're not having an issue with, and one or two that you are. And, why do you want to put a dictatorial policy in place that's going to talk about what you can't do in the workplace because you have one or two people abusing what you think your workplace should be? I think it's really important to be addressing it with those particular individuals, as opposed to necessarily putting a policy in place that's going to address that particular situation, because by and large, most of your employees are behaving the way that they should be. So you have to be a little bit careful of over policing your workplace. And again, when you're figuring out what's going to go in there, wishful thinking doesn't really belong in a handbook. And again, that can get you into more trouble, because if you're putting wishful thinking in there, but it's a policy that you're just not following, an employment attorney is going to have a heyday with that, because they're going to say, you're not following this. So how do we know you're following anything else in your handbook? That handbook is null and void. One of the biggest things that I see in handbooks under that category of wishful thinking is we do performance appraisals for all of our employees annually. And I always ask people, do you? And usually, sometimes I get the answer of yes, we really do that. We do them every year. We do them all in the month of January. 9 times out of 10, I say, well, that's what we hope we're doing. So put it in there to show everybody that this is what we should be doing. But reality is they're really not doing it. So, if that's the case, you're better off with more loose wording that says, we strive to provide feedback on a regular basis, and leave it at that. If you really don't think you're going to stick to once a year, don't put it in there. And again, then you need to kind of, once it's all together, once you put a policy together, get your critical thinking cap on and take a look at it for any kind of unintentional entitlement to employment, to any kind of a promotion, salary increase. You have to be careful when you ever mention a salary increase. Saying after 3 months, you get a salary increase. And then all of a sudden you've got a downturn in your business and you're not giving anybody a salary increase, but your handbook says after 3 months, you get a salary increase. It's going to get you into trouble. It's probably best off. And this is, again, the difference between a handbook and a procedures manual, because you might want to have a procedure in there that all of our managers are going to give the new employees a salary increase after 3 months. But if you want to leave room for the exception of that's just not going to happen in this situation. So probably doesn't belong in a handbook. So there's a unique balance when you're actually developing a policy that you've got to strike, right? You want to show commitment to your employees on one side. On the other side, there is a certain need for consistency in the workplace, right? And for law and order in the workplace. And again, the kind of balance that you strike is going to be different from organization to organization. If you've got a manufacturing environment where jobs are much more cut and dry, you can probably have more of a rule bend, more rules in place. But if you're an office environment and people are, professional level employees who are pretty much coming and going as they please, they're exempt, you're expecting them to do their job, you don't need to have a whole lot of rules in place for your workplace. So, but it's striking that balance that's right for your organization. I think on the side of committing to your employees, it is important, and I go back to that managing to the exception. It's important to assume that your employees want to do the right thing. And if you have the exception, you address the exception as opposed to putting a rule in place for managing that exception. if that makes sense. So you want the tone of your handbook to be, we trust that you as an employee, we trust you to do the right thing. And that really creates a lot of loyalty. There isn't a whole lot of loyalty if you have a whole lot of rules in place and they're cracking the whip if somebody breaks the rule, right? That's not a real pleasant work environment to be working in. Your employees want to feel that they're being trusted and that they are being trusted to behave appropriately and to do the right thing. And you'll find that if you don't have a lot of those rules in place, the employee engagement does tend to go up. And you want to show that, hey, we care about you as an employee. And by micromanaging them and throwing a lot of rules at them, that's kind of sending a mixed message. On the other hand, you need to have some parameters in place because there's that need for consistency, for treating people fairly and somewhat equitably. And you should have parameters in place for how do you expect employees to treat each other? How do you expect your employees to be treating clients? And you also want to leave a lot of flexibility in there to make the decisions that are appropriate for the situation at hand. So it's important to leave room for operating in that gray area of, okay, what do we do here? Let's take a look at all the facts. How have we treated people previously in similarly situated circumstances? So you've got some guideline of this is what we will generally do, but you're not backed into a corner of, well, our manual says we need to do this. I don't really want to do this because I'm not feeling this is really appropriate. But if you've got that rule book in place, you may be roped into something that just doesn't make sense for this situation. So it's a balancing act, and it's not always easy to strike that balance. And it can take a lot of back and forth with your senior management team. It can take a lot of rewording until you've actually gotten it right. So again, you're kind of leaving room for that. It depends, because so many situations in the workplace, they're gray, right? There is no right way to handle it. There's no wrong way to handle it. Sometimes there is, but most of the time there isn't. There's always it depends. And you kind of have to gather the facts, and you want to be able to make the decision that's that makes sense. So your policies should leave room for that. So I wanted to put some examples here, and this is where I'm hoping you're all going to unmute, or somebody's going to unmute, and we can get a little bit of discussion going. I've taken this example out of an actual handbook, for a company that I've revised a handbook on, and this is what the original policy looked like. It was a conflict resolution policy. So it said, whenever a group of people are required to work together for an extended period of time, problems and misunderstandings can occur. A formal complaint procedure has been established to provide you with a prompt and fair means of resolving personal complaints regarding work or working relationships. This procedure guarantees courteous and fair treatment, and there shall be no reprisals against you for voicing your concerns, provided you follow the established procedure and behave in a courteous and respectful manner. Employees are encouraged to follow this procedure. Step 1, discuss the problem with your immediate supervisor unless the problem is with the supervisor. Step 2, if a satisfactory resolution of the problem does not occur within a reasonable time, the problem should be presented in writing to the president. He will take appropriate action, and the decision is final and binding. So what do we think of this? What are some issues that you're seeing with having a policy like this in a handbook? Feel free to unmute.
Hi, this is Michelle.
Hi, Michelle. Thank you.
You're welcome. One issue that I think I see is that it implies that whatever the outcome, people are going to be happy with it or satisfied with it, and I don't know that that's always the case.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a good point. Other thoughts?
Susan, this is Dorothy.
Hi.
Hi. No picture for me today. My first thought when reading this is it's an ideal situation. Not everybody is comfortable going to their supervisor. If there's a problem with the supervisor, it only leaves you one route to take.
Yep, yep. That's definitely an issue with this. Other thoughts?
Susan, I think with the words in here that says this procedure guarantees really jumps out at me. And also in the step 2, this decisions are final and binding. I mean, those are some pretty strong words to be using.
Absolutely. And those are kind of one of those key words that you shouldn't have in a handbook because, you know, what don't we want that handbook to be, right? An implied contract. That's contractual language, guarantee, final and binding. That kind of negates that whole employment at will.
Right.
Really good. Other thoughts?
Hi, this is Karen. I feel like it doesn't leave open discussion or mediation or anything else. It's like 2 steps and you're done. And I don't feel like 2 steps and done may solve all problems.
Yeah, I agree. It's kind of dictatorial. I'm not sure employees want to be dictated to, right? It's a little controlling.
Yeah, it is very structured. And I also think like the first step to resolving a conflict is to talk to the people involved or to try to get the 2 people together before it moves up to a higher level.
Yeah. Yep. Very good point. And any other thoughts? Yeah, these are all really, really good points. And these are the things that jumped out at me as soon as I read it. And you pretty much hit on the big ones. So, you know, as an alternative, I like something more like an open door policy where you're taught, and you can copy this if you want to take this and use it in your handbook, go right ahead. Where, you know, you're talking about instead of these are the procedures if you have a complaint, you know, why not just say we have an open door policy, right? Our management team is here to talk to you. We want your feedback. This says, you know, we're talking about an open door policy at all levels of management. You're encouraged to express your opinions, concerns, and suggestions. So again, it's putting that positive spin. It's not just if you have a grievance, if you have a problem, come to us. It's come to us with your opinions, come to us with your concerns. Go to your appropriate manager. That's what we definitely would recommend that you do. You can go to the president. You know, you can go to any member of the senior management team. You can have that in there, you know, again, whatever is appropriate for your particular organization. But the spin on this is so different, right? It's we're eager to assist you instead of you need to do this, right? Much different tone. And it is, you know, back to the concern about, you know, discussing it with the people that are really involved. It is encouraging them to discuss any kind of an issue with your immediate supervisor first. But it's opening that door and it's saying, you know, in a lot of ways, that's as far as any concerns need to go. But it's also saying that, you know, if that's not the route that you feel comfortable taking, because what if the issue really is with the supervisor? And this kind of goes, it kind of piggybacks off of if you haven't already taken a look at the model sexual harassment policy, the tone is kind of the same in that with, you know, we encourage you to discuss it with the perpetrator, but if that's not always going to be appropriate and you have other avenues. So an open door policy is saying, you know, we want to talk to you and we want to hear from you, as opposed to come to us if there's a problem. And by the way, if you don't follow this procedure, we don't want to hear from you. Your complaint isn't valid. So feel free to use this policy, but I think it sets, you can kind of see how it sets a totally different tone. So I've got another sample for you, again, hoping you will all participate. This was a sample of a dress code policy that was in a particular handbook that I worked on. You are expected to dress in a manner that befits the job you perform. Business casual attire is acceptable. Inappropriate apparel under our policy includes, but is not limited to, and then it lists all of these things. Employees should be well groomed. Anyone violating this policy will be immediately sent home. So what do we think? Thoughts, feedback? Is this something you'd put into place?
I'm surprised they started listing things. That could just go on and on.
Well, it could. And Jill, that's a really good point that, where do you stop with what's
Exactly.
appropriate and what isn't appropriate? And
Yeah. Oh, it's not on the list, so I wore it, and
right. Exactly. If somebody calls you out on how you're dressed, they can say, well, I had no idea, this should be okay. And then what happens is you're going to have the manager coming to you and saying, well, we need to add this, and this to the list.
exactly. And are they really going to be immediately sent home? I mean, that's like slap on the hand. It's just
Right.
like you're
right.
a little kid,
Yeah, well, that's exactly it. To me, this read kind of like a school dress code policy.
Yeah. Like you can't be trusted to dress yourself in the morning.
That's exactly it. And, we go back to what I said with you want to be instilling trust, right? This isn't really instilling trust. And I also had to laugh because this was an older policy. Flip-flops. Flip-flops for women nowadays are just almost standard summer attire because
Yeah.
flip-flops can be quite fancy and quite formal. So, it was very out of date.
Yeah, it cracked me up a little bit.
Yeah, exactly. Any other thoughts on this?
Susan, the one thing that comes to mind though is on the last sentence, or inappropriate apparel under our policy, but is not limited to, includes, but is not limited to. So the items that they listed are some items, but they're trying to cover their base and say, well, it includes these and also could include others.
Right. But it's and it could, and that included but not limited to is a really nice term to have in a lot of policies. But again, when you're listing it, it can start getting out of hand because what's appropriate. And the other thing is, if you look at these things, a lot of them are applying, not a lot, but in some cases, I've seen policies that are listing things that are very female oriented. They're things that a woman would wear, not necessarily that a man would wear. And I took one look at it and said, really? So you're dictating how your women can dress, but you don't really care how your men dress. So, that's another issue that you can run across when you're listing things like that. Any other thoughts? So let's take a look at what we turned that policy into. Dress code and public image, because this was an organization that dealt with the public, so they wanted their employees to reflect a certain level of professionalism. So they're saying we expect you to dress in a manner that befits the job you perform. Because again, you may have very different departments in your organization where dress codes are going to be very different. If you've got salespeople, how you expect them to dress is going to be different than how you would expect a warehouse person to dress, right? So this kind of addresses the fact that there is no one size fits all. And that's the other issue when you start listing things where it gets into trouble, because tank tops, if you're working in a hot manufacturing environment, a tank top, you may not care that somebody's wearing a tank top, but put that person out in a customer service role and the tank top is an issue. So you should present a clean and professional appearance when you represent us, whether you're inside or out of the office, and we expect you to behave in a professional business-like manner. So again, it's kind of hitting on that behavior too, which I think is good. And this could also be turned into, you could insert in here that you expect anybody working remotely to also be following this dress code if your remote employees could end up on camera at any point. I know when I get up in the morning, it's really tempting sometimes to, get get off of the elliptical machine, have my hair all over the place, but I realize I could be getting a Microsoft Teams call at any point, and I better look a little bit nicer than that. So you can kind of tweak this to include your remote workers as well. And then, you know, it goes on to say the current dress code is business professional. You're expected to use common sense in your choice of business attire. So again, building that trust, right? We trust that you are going to use your common sense. And then if you do have an employee that does not use their common sense, that's where you can address it with that particular employee and say, you know, we just wanted to remind you, here's our dress code policy. We don't think that what you've been wearing is really in keeping with that. Any questions or any feedback on this?
There
Okay.
isn't anything in the chat, so.
Okay, thank you. So, you know, again, with the effective policies, you know, they should be clear enough to give guidance and to promote that consistency, but you have to leave them vague enough to allow for that flexibility when it's warranted. And again, clear enough to comply with your local and federal standards and for your statutes. So some of those policies, there is no room for gray. For example, that I've referred to it before, the sexual harassment policy, that is really cut and dry. You can't leave too much room for gray there. But you've got to have that vague enough to be applicable to the different situations, to different work locations, right? Because what's appropriate in one environment of your organization might not be appropriate in another. You know, you need to kind of have that, again, that balance between clear and vague. So I've now probably just totally confused you, right? Any questions or thoughts on this? Is anybody feeling that they're now going to be a little more challenged when putting some of these policies together?
I'm really glad to get these guidelines. Extremely glad.
Okay, good. And you know, one thing that I want to say regarding policies, and this may be true of your organization or it may not, but you might get some senior management pushback on the vague, because some people like to have rules to follow, because then they don't have to make the hard decisions. I know I'm being a little harsh on some management because they're not all like that, but there are some who they just don't want to make the tough calls. They want to look at a policy manual and say, well, I have to do this because this is what our policy manual says. Instead of saying, you know what, I really need to take some pretty tough action on this and to take ownership of that. So you might be getting some pushback, you know, for two reasons. Number one, it does mean that there are some more difficult case-by-case decisions that are going to have to be made. And number two, very often senior management team is older, and they're more rooted in the kind of handbook that I dealt with for the first 20 years being in human resources, the more dictatorial, the more policy and procedure oriented. And sometimes it's kind of hard to let go of that. But I'm hoping that I've given you some good ideas for how you can work with your management team to get on board with this if you think that's going to be an issue. Any other thoughts or feedback you want to share? Okay.
If
You,
we have, excuse me.
Yeah.
If we have concerns over something, would we be able to contact you and ask you, you know, if our wording is appropriate or not appropriate, or should we just send it to the attorney?
you know, if you want the occasional feedback, I'm happy to do that, but I don't want to get too deep into the weeds without actually having a contract in place for helping you with the wording, because that could, you know, potentially come back to bite us. So, you know, if you want to work with me on a handbook on a certain level, let's talk and we can see what we might be able to put together, because I've had some organizations just say, just do my handbook And then, I'll work with them, of course, to craft the policies, and others that have just said, this is where I think I need some work, or this is my draft. Can you work with me on the draft? And, we'll price it accordingly. So
Okay, all right, super, thank you.
you're welcome.
Mhm.
Any other thoughts or comments on policies? Okay, so some helpful hints on the actual wording that you're going to use. Words, inclusive language, I think is really important in today's world where diversity, equity, inclusion is very important. So take a look at your pronouns. A lot of handbooks they use the word he, or they use he/she. You may want to think about replacing that with gender neutral pronouns. Just a thought. If you want the tone of your handbook to, again, have that more personalized tone to it, instead of using the company and saying employees, you might want to use the pronouns, you and we. Again, it kind of depends on that tone that you want to strike. Language that implies flexibility. I love these words. Generally, typically, right? As opposed to will and must and, guarantee. That was the word that Anita brought up. And the word guarantee just doesn't belong in a handbook. And you can do a word search when you're done and just kind of take a look and make sure that you didn't overlook an old policy that was using some of that language. The word probationary. This still showing up in handbooks. Probationary can fall into that realm of implied contract. So if your handbook says all of our employees start out with a 3-month probationary period, and after that probationary period, they're eligible for their benefits. They're eligible for a performance appraisal or a salary increase. The word probationary needs to go. You can, because again, it implies that that employee is guaranteed employment for that period of time. So if you're saying that we call it a probationary period because they're eligible for their benefits after 2 months of employment, then just say you're eligible for your benefits after 2 months of employment instead of after a 2-month probationary period. So it's all in how you word it and the kind of wording that you use. The word permanent, yeah, that probably is one of those things you should do that document search on, because that doesn't belong there either, because in the workplace, nothing is permanent. I don't think that's hit home any better than the last 10 months, right? So those are kind of the buzzwords that you should be on the lookout for.
Hi, Susan. Can I ask a question about probationary?
Sure.
We use the word introductory period. Is that any better or worse?
Probably no better.
Okay.
It's, I wouldn't go there. I really wouldn't call it any kind of a period at all, because reality is, if it's not working out, you want to be able to terminate that person. You shouldn't be implying that you're going to give them a certain period of time before you make the decision to terminate them. And I think even an introductory period kind of implies that we're going to employ you through that introductory period. And again, these are the kinds of things that an employment attorney would say have been challenged in court, and it has not gone the way of the employer. So you're really just best off saying, we're going to talking about how you're going to onboard them, right? And how you're going to train them without actually putting a time frame on it is probably the best way to go, because you want to have that flexibility that if somebody isn't showing up for work or has been late 3 times in their first week of work, you don't want to have to keep them any longer than that. You want to be able to just let them go right then and there.
Great.
Good
Thank
question. Really good question. Any other questions on the wording? Okay. So if you are a multi-state employer, your handbook automatically becomes a little bit more complicated, because you need to take some time to research what some of the specific laws are in the states in which you have employees. And this, I think, is going to become more of an issue going forward with remote workplaces, because some organizations are moving now towards a more remote workforce, which means that you could be hiring people in different states. And you might have one employee in the state of Iowa, another one in California. Beware of California, by the way. They are the most difficult state to navigate regarding employment law. So if you have even one employee in California, you need to start educating yourself. And a good way to do this is HR 360. It's got a state resources tab. Go to that state resources, and then on the left-hand side, it's going to list all the different categories, and you can click on and read up on the employment law in that particular state and determine what does and what does not apply to you. And you can do, you can manage this a couple of ways. We are fortunate in living in Vermont. We're pretty well legislated in the employment world. So a lot of times, if you're covering your bases and you're compliant with employment law in the state of Vermont, you're going to be compliant in the other states. So, for example, our earned sick time is relatively generous. Chances are our standards are going to meet the standards of the other states as well, but you need to double check that because that's not always the case. So, you could adopt company-wide policies that are consistent with the most stringent state in which you have employees. So that's one way of doing it. Another way of doing it is kind of a state by state. The state by state thing can get really tricky because you're going to have a handbook that potentially has different state addendums. Employees are going to see, well, I'll use for an example, we have the earned sick leave law. If you have an employee in Kansas, there is no earned sick leave law. So you're going to allow employees in Vermont to get 5 paid sick days, but you're not going to allow that for your employee in Kansas. And that employee is going to say, well, that's not fair, right? So, I think that it probably isn't a bad idea to actually be adopting that, most stringent law and just make it apply to everybody. It just makes it easier. And chances are it's not going to be a burden on your organization because some of these state laws are just so similar that it really isn't going to be a material difference from one to the other. But what you have to kind of pay attention to is things like dissemination of information. Like Vermont, you have to disseminate your sexual harassment policy. So you're covered with that if you put it into the handbook and your employees acknowledge the receipt of their handbook. You're covered. I would say as a best practice, take it one step further and actually have them sign off on a separate acknowledgement of the sexual harassment policy. But that's a best practice. It's not mandated. Some states are mandating sexual harassment training. Vermont does not yet anyway. Other states do. New York does. California does. And it needs to meet certain standards. So you have to be aware of what else do you need to be paying attention to in other states when and this is over and above your handbook. You need to be paying attention to what do you need to do? What are the dissemination requirements? California, again, they have to get a notice when you're hired saying that you're entitled to pick your own workers' comp physician if you want. And there's an actual notice that has to go to employees on that. So, take a look at it because some of these things might be best disseminated in your employee handbook. And I do think if you have specific notices that need to go out to employees from specific states, that I find the most organized way to do it is to just have a state addendum. Might work, it might not. It kind of depends on your organization and the states in which you have employees. So remember, again, it's not just the states where you have operations. If you have one employee in that state working remotely, you're considered to have operations in that state. So when you're putting it all together, a couple things that I would recommend is to make it as online friendly as possible because that's where a lot of your employees go for their information nowadays. Again, it depends on your organization. Maybe your employees don't use a computer doing their everyday job, in which case they're going to want a paper copy. So you should always have that paper copy available. But if you're putting it out online, a clickable table of contents is really, really helpful because again, you want it to be user friendly. You want it to be used. Inserting links in it that will send them elsewhere. Again, if you have a dress code policy and it says as part of this dress code, we expect all of our safety attire to be adhered to as well, you can put in there a link that will actually link to what the safety attire protocol is. Again, it makes it all much more user friendly. You can link to your benefits documents. You don't need to be putting your summary of benefits and coverage into your employee handbook, but you could say, you can find all of our benefits documents on our server, and here is where on the server you can find it. So, again, and I would consider addendums if you've got state-specific communications that you need to do. And the last step, again, should always be an attorney review. If you've taken the time to put a good handbook together, or, for example, the handbooks that I've worked on, the attorney review, I'm kind of proud of this, tends to be minimal, but they're always going to find a little bit of wording somewhere that they think might present some risk. And I, as an employer, I would really appreciate that, because you just want to make sure that the handbook, no handbook is ever going to be risk-free. You just never know, but you want to do what you can to minimize the risk. And it's worth the couple $100 or however much it's going to cost to do it, because if it ever gets challenged, it's going to cost you a heck of a lot more than that. So I really, really recommend that you do that. And the other piece of it is that it's really important to be engaging your management team and to be getting them on board with what's in this handbook and with how to use this handbook. I would absolutely recommend actually doing a rollout, and I would roll it out to your managers so that they're aware of what's in there and they're aware of these new protocols, because some of it may be new. They're aware of what their responsibilities are. And then I would totally roll it out to the employees so that they understand that, hey, I have a resource, I have somewhere that I can go. I guarantee it's going to cut down on the number of phone calls that you get saying, when am I eligible for my PTO again? It would be really simple if you've got your good handbook in place to say, oh, you know what? Let's take a look at your employee handbook and see what that says, so that you're planting that seed that, oh yeah, I guess I could have just gone to the handbook to get that answer, right? And when you're talking to your managers and your supervisors and rolling it out to them, I think it's important to let them know that part of their role is to use this as their guide as well, so that when they're getting questions or they're getting issues in their workplace, in their department, and they're not really sure how to handle it, they might very well be able to find some guidance in the handbook as far as what to do, instead of just saying, oh my God, throwing their hands up and saying, what do? I don't know what to do. I need to go to human resources. This is going to help to be their guide as well. And, always encourage ongoing usage of it. It shouldn't be something that just sits out there on the server. This should be a live document and something that can be tweaked as it needs to be tweaked. If you're finding that a certain component isn't really meshing with what you think the intent of it was, and you need to be making some changes, this is a living document. You should absolutely be able to go in there and make changes. And then, you don't need to be communicating every little change in wording to your employees. But if it's something that's going to substantially change a protocol, then absolutely it should be rolled out to your employees as well. And again, when you're talking to your management team about it, it's a way of kind of working with them so that they have a good handle on, when do I get my answer from the handbook, and when do I contact HR? For example, they can look at, what if they get a sexual harassment complaint? They can certainly look in the handbook and kind of have an understanding of what they should be doing and where they should be going, but that policy should be pretty clear that they should be contacting HR and bringing you into the fold as well. I really am a big proponent of incorporating it into your onboarding process, not just putting it out there and saying, here's where your handbook can be found, but actually review it with your new hires, or expect your managers to be reviewing it with their new hires. I honestly think it has more impetus when a manager does it, but every situation is different. Because you want to show your employees that, hey, this is a really useful tool for you. And again, especially if you've got the tone in there of, hey, we appreciate you as an employee, you want to share that. So, and the handbook does that. And you want to make sure that your employees are feeling that with that document. Again, make it easily accessible online, but always have a paper version available for your employees, because some people just still like to have that paper in hand. I like to incorporate it into your management meetings. If you're involved with senior management meetings, you know, maybe when if you have regular, say, for example, once a month meetings, you know, maybe you have a policy of the month and you go over that policy at the meeting so that everybody's on board with it. And it's kind of keeping that handbook front and center. I also think it's important that you calendar a reminder, if that's what it takes, every year, same time of year, to just take the time out to take a look at the handbook, make sure that it's still relevant, make sure that there's nothing in there that's on that wish list of we should be doing this and we're really not. And make sure that it's updated as laws change, as policies change. You know, we try our best at NFP to keep you updated on some of these statutes that might require a change to your handbook. So, you know, keep an eye on your emails when you get emails from us, both on the benefit side and also from myself on the HR side, because we do try to keep you updated on these things. So that about wraps it up. What kinds of questions do we have out there about anything that I've covered? Any thoughts? Any questions?
Good refresher. Thank you.
You're welcome. And like I said, the slides will be going out. The recording will be going out. And if you have other questions, feel free to reach out to me. Any other thoughts?
I'm just glad that you said you don't have to include everything, because I know some of the partners here want to include everything that could ever happen. It's like, oh my God, this is a 500-page book already. No one's gonna read it.
I don't want to disparage people who work in particular types of jobs, but I find it in accounting firms and engineering firms.
Yeah, it's a little scary. So I'm really glad to have some parameters that kind of will keep them hopefully in line.
Well,
So thank you.
you know, they're the rule followers, right? And that's just how it is. And you know, it is what it is. We're glad that they're rule followers because accountants should be following rules. But when it comes to HR, maybe not so much.
Yeah, no, this has been a struggle. So this is good. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Okay, well, thank you everybody very much. I appreciate it. And I'm also going to be sending out a survey. So please take a couple of minutes to complete that. I welcome your feedback, and I also want to see your feedback regarding other topics that you'd like to see covered, because I really depend on you to let me know what's important to you. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Susan.
Thank you.